Let Me Tell You a Story is a product of Carolina Storyteller, starring Jonathan Phoenix, written, produced, and directed by Jonathan Phoenix, edited and recorded by Jonathan Phoenix, and horribly marketed by Jonathan Phoenix. Man, I gotta hire a staff. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can go to patreon.com/Carolina Storyteller and subscribe to get exclusive content and all kinds of other neat stuff. We even have merchandise coming. Anyway, sit back and enjoy the show. How's it going, folks? Welcome back to the show. I am Jonathan Phoenix, the Carolina Storyteller. I hope you guys had a great week. I appreciate you being here to join me tonight. This week, I've got a guest on the show, Brandon Schexnayder. I hope I didn't butcher that, Brandon. He's going to be here with us, and we're going to talk about the Julie Brown story that I shared a couple of weeks ago, because Brandon happens to be kind of an expert on it. So, Brandon, how you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on, Jonathan.
I really appreciate it. Now, Brandon, you have a podcast where you do kind of the similar thing. What's the name of that podcast again?
Sure. It's called Southern Gothic.
So, now you are out in Tennessee, but you grew up in New Orleans.
That's correct. Yeah, I live just south of Nashville now. I live an area called Franklin, a town called Franklin, where that pretty grisly Civil War battle here. I've been up here for, not quite 20 years at this point, but born and raised down in New Orleans. Yeah.
Okay. So, of course, anywhere there's a Civil War battle, you've probably got plenty of ghost stories. But
yeah.
We want to focus on your childhood home, primarily Auntie Julia from the Montauk Swamp.
Yeah.
Did I pronounce that right?
Not quite, but that's all right. It's called the Manchac Swamp, so it's pretty.
Manchac, okay.
Look, we sound really yatty down there, so you can really dive in. But yeah, it's a great place, man. It's a really it's a story that I have loved for a while now. It's something that has fascinated us. It's actually not something that I grew up with. It's something that a little later in life, my sister, who's a researcher on the podcast, she's kind of my partner in crime with Southern Gothic. She is a master's in library science and archivist down at the Louisiana State Museum. So a researcher by trade. She's gotten really interested in this topic. She had come across it. I want to say it was sometime in her college years. It showed up on a MTV TV show. Now, I don't know if you remember this show. There was only about 4 episodes, and gosh, I was trying to look real quick to see if I could give you a rundown on it. Unfortunately, I don't see my notes here on it. But it was like a reality TV show where they took folks out into the swamps. Was it Fear? Was that what it was called?
Or something like that. I remember the show. I was really intrigued by it because it was a different take on the whole paranormal investigation show.
Yeah. And maybe it was Fear. It was early 2000s. They only got off, like I said, about 4 episodes, though. Yeah,
it didn't last very long. But I remember the show myself. And I think a lot of my listeners, because I'm really good with the 34 to, I'm really good with the Gen X demographic, so they probably remember it too. And they're all going, oh yeah, that show that only lasted for like a month. Came out right before Halloween and ended right around Halloween.
There's probably, yeah.
But it was featured on that show.
Yeah, it was featured. Yeah, so that one came out, I want to say 2005. And so it basically, it was, that's how my sister kind of learned about it. Now that little part of town right there, if you do go down to New Orleans and you were to visit, you can actually go visit it if you drive up to Baton Rouge. You drive west out of New Orleans, get on I-55. You get about halfway, you're just gonna end up over the swamp. I mean, almost immediately after you leave the city, about 5 or 10 minutes after you leave the city, you're just on these long concrete bridges that are just, over the swamp right there. And about halfway between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, there's a turnoff right there. I guess you're on I-10, you split to I-55, and there's a turnoff right there that's going to go on this little isthmus that's between the Lake Maurepas and Lake Pontchartrain there. And that's the spot where Julia actually in Frenier was, right there. It's a fantastic seafood restaurant, by the way, if you get a chance to go out there, called Middendorf's. But yeah, so it's, probably about 30, 45 minutes out of New Orleans. head out there. You can go check it out. It's I-55. There's a swamp tour today that you can go to called Cajun Pride Swamp Tour, and you can take a boat, take a little daytime tour through the swamp, and they actually, part of the land that they own there, we have found is part of the land that she owned in life, actually. Part of the
wow!
Cajun Pride
So
Swamp.
she owns part of it. So that was part of her land,
right? So she owned about 40 acres of land out there. So I'll tell you a little bit about her as a person. I know there's the myth, but she owned about 40. Well, she started out there with 40 acres of land. Her husband Celestin actually fought for the United States Army in the Civil War. He was part of the U.S. colored troops, and so he was given a land grant to that property out there, and that's how they ended up in the swamp with all those German folk.
Okay, so that does explain a lot about how she got out there. And now she'd sit on her porch and she'd sing songs, playing her guitar in her spare time. Is that right?
Right. Yeah. So the way the typical story, and I apologize, I didn't realize you just covered this. I would have listened to your story so we could link it up a little bit better. But yeah, the traditional telling, depending on who you kind of ask and what angle you go, is that she's out there in the swamp. She's your typical. She's your midwife, your kind of healer, all of those things, right? Because there wasn't a doctor around, and you'd have to wait for the train to get down to New Orleans. The only way into Frenier was by train or boat at that point in time, which is crazy to think about at the same time, because this is early 20th century. This is 1915 when this happened. So, don't think that this is way back. This is, I guess it's 100 years, but this is 1915 with cars at that point, right? So
yeah, it was one of the things that I actually found amazing about the story, is that it was so close to our now. And the situation, the way that I do emergency management, and that's what my degrees are in.
Uh-huh.
And so one of the biggest things that I've studied is Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah.
Storm hit in 1915 is almost exactly the way it hit in 2004.
That's exactly, that's unfortunately, yeah. And part of, if you go through what we question with the story, even, and the way the story's evolved, does kind of touch into that, and I can go into that as well. I mean, because there's essentially, the way the story is as we know it today is, she gets upset with the town at some point, right? So she's at that point, we believe she had 3 kids based on census records. Celestin passed away, so she's living out there alone. Supposedly, the town, there's an issue with the town, right? And of course, she sits out there and she's warning them, when I die, I'll take the whole town with me. When I die, I'll take the whole town with me, right? And that's what she's singing on the rocking chair. And then, of course, she dies. And 2 days later, this massive storm comes through. But what's happened with this tale, and what we have found so interesting, is trying to decipher Julia Brown as this individual and this person, and what is real and historical and accurate versus what the story itself has grown into as to the way we tell it now, and how that story has even changed. And I think, talking about Katrina even plays a part in it, because as we've looked through newspaper records and looked up, things of that nature, it was actually published in October 2nd, right after the storm in 1915. There was a Times-Picayune article that discussed her funeral and how all of these people showed up. And it said she's a big property owner, and it's there at her funeral. This is a newspaper article 2 days after this story, to really just hammer home what that legend is, where, the way I tell the legend is that this hurricane, everybody's at her funeral trying to appease her soul because they're scared of this song that she's been singing. And while they're at her funeral, the storm hits and the wind comes and the rain and all. And that's exactly what this newspaper article says. It talks about it, and it talks about her casket actually being her casket, she's put in a wooden box and it's sealed. But, at about 4 o'clock or so, the storm hits, and the storm actually takes her casket away, and she actually floats off. And all of this is actually recorded in the Times-Picayune.
Now, see, I didn't get that part. I had read that, and granted, I only gotten to do a few days worth of. recording my episodes. I finish one and I start researching the
next
one.
It's hard doing it. You don't have to explain. Yeah.
And so what I had gotten was that it was around 4 o'clock, but reports that I had gotten was that as they were putting her into the ground, the storm came up. But I didn't get that floated away. I did get that everybody went to try and hide in the train depot. Is that still factual?
So yes, some people did do that. They have reports of different. There's about 25 people did go and get on the train. The train actually took off, went a little ways down the road, but was eventually kind of bogged in because of the water. So they didn't get too far, but they were saved because of it. I mean, absolutely. Now, the most horrific one, and one that's kind of, I don't have written records. There was an oral history. There's a book that was written based on an interview with a young woman who was on the train, who actually made it out with the train. She said that there were folks climbing trees to get away from the rising waters. If you can just imagine that horror right there. But yeah, I mean, it was brutal. That hurricane, the story itself and the Julia Brown story almost doesn't even do it justice, how difficult or how awful of a storm it was.
Oh, no, I agree. I lived through Hurricane Hugo here in South Carolina, and we have a school that a lot of people used for shelter during the storm. And when the surge came up, the school was not nearly high enough, and they actually had to stuff people. They were stuffing children in the ceiling tiles to get them out of the water, and didn't know if that was going to. The water actually came up to the ceiling before it started to subside, and there was a real terror for I think it was 400 or 500 people that were there.
Yeah,
going to be drowned in what was supposed to be their refuge. Hurricanes are no joke. So the fact that Julie Brown, Auntie Julia, just kind of predicted this in a way it's really amazing.
Yeah, and it's changed whether or not it's been a curse or not, right? Like, it depends on who you ask, and that's always what I kind of, we look at, because over the years, you had that newspaper article that talked about her missing, but it never said anything about voodoo, and it never said anything about her being the cause or anything like that, right? This newspaper article just says, the storm hit when they were at her funeral. Now there was a newspaper article in the 70s as well that talked about it, and it talked to a woman named Helen Schlosser-Berg, who she was that child that survived, and they asked her. By this point in the 70s, they were already talking about voodoo. They were already saying, this woman, everybody says she called this storm, and and Helen actually claimed up and down, said, "Hey, I don't think she cursed us. I think she was warning us." And that was kind of her angle back in the 70s. But, once TV got a hold, it was Extreme Paranormal. That was the show on MTV.
Okay.
It was called Extreme Paranormal, and they went out there. So once we get to, this is early 2000s at this point, we're no longer looking at her as that. It's now kind of a horror movie type, villain of a voodoo priestess cursing the town.
Now, see, actually, it does make sense that she would be a voodoo priestess, but not, because if you've done any studies of the voodoo or the hoodoo, or the voodoo religion or the hoodoo practice, neither one of them are meant to do harm. They're actually meant for protection, and voodoo was actually a religion. So she would have been warning. That does make a lot more sense, which would kind of make her an attempted hero, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And there's everybody is taking a different angle on that about it. A lot of people do say, like we're talking about Katrina right now, this woman that, maybe it wasn't even supernatural. Maybe what she's doing is, when I die, the whole town's going to go with me. And what she's warning it, this was a logging community. This was a logging community that was cutting down all the cypress trees out there. We were literally cutting down the swamp out there. And she very much, that could have been what she was saying, was, you guys are destroying our home. And sure enough, Katrina wouldn't even have been as bad as it was had it not been, for what was going on out in the swamp at this point. Those swamps have been decimated compared to what they were. And that's part of what Frenier was. It was logging. And they, of all things, they also grew cabbage. out there, but a very, very large cypress logging community. So there's definitely that angle as well of, is it her kind of saying, guys, this is, you're destroying, what's going to take care of it. You're going to destroy what takes care of us. So, yeah.
So after the storm and after the hurricane, the legend goes on that she's actually out there in the swamp. Mm-hmm. And some say that she's been heard cackling. Others say that you can just see her moving amongst the cypress trees. I had to blend between the two of them. But you've been out there. Do you feel anything, or do you think that anything's out there? You think maybe still watching over the swamp?
I haven't felt anything while we're out there. I don't feel like I've never felt like there's something wrong while we're out in the swamp in that way. I've never gone out at night or anything. There's certainly been people who have discussed exactly what you're saying, whether or not they hear her out there. There is a no sleep post on Reddit from about 7 years ago that talks about running into someone that sounds like it would be Julia Brown. But it was really a kind of mischievous, malevolent ghost even there. And I don't think that this was a malevolent woman. I don't think that this was somebody who was cursing the town, even though that's kind of the way that the story has really taken hold. I don't. I think that she was part of that community. I think that maybe there's a lot of misunderstanding in that community. She certainly didn't fit in. She was on the edge of it. But when we talk about her spirit herself, I do tell people that I think as we tell the story, and this has been this particular story has been a very large part of our podcast. Not that we cover it all. We've only covered it, on an episode, but it's been a very large part of the work that we do outside. With my sister has gotten published in journals, paranormal journals, talking about this. I tell this story on several podcasts. I've told the story. I've told the story. I tell it at my live show. I do these live shows, these kind of like live Southern storytelling, like campfire shows almost. She's almost always what I lead with, almost out of superstition now, because it seemed like every time we covered her and every time we told her story, and we told it in a way that treated her as a human, as opposed to this malevolent voodoo priestess of folklore, it seemed like something good happened to us. And just as recently as it was Hurricane Ivan a few years ago, my sister, she still lives down in New Orleans. She had just wrapped up writing a submission about Julia Brown, like about a 6,000 word journal article she sent off to this book called Feminine Macabre. It's this book of the paranormal for women. And she just finished doing this, and Hurricane Ivan was on its way to New Orleans, and she had kind of texted me and joked, said, I'm going to our parents. She's going to our parents' house to stay with them while the hurricane passes, and I'm going to light a candle for Julia to take care of me. Hands down is what she said, and she came back the next day, the storm had passed or whatever, and she goes by her house, and there's this giant tree limb. No real major damage, but this giant tree limb, probably about a foot in diameter, just fell about 6 inches from her bedroom. Just immense limb off this oak tree, but good stuff has happened as well. Our podcast got a huge bump in listenership a few years ago. The podcast Morbid, it's this just giant. It's one of the top podcasts on all the charts and everything. They had mentioned us. They had mentioned how, you should check out this great storytelling show. And it just so happened that the show that they mentioned us was also the one where they covered Julia Brown. So it's been a running theme for us that we kind of feel like the more we really talk about her as a human and as a woman, and we present this to people and say it's a wonderful story, and it's caused us to remember who she is. But the more I kind of do that, the more I feel like her spirit's kind of watching out for us, whether she practices voodoo or not,
Yeah, that actually, it's probably makes a lot of sense. When you think about it, everything up until the end of her life shows that she was a very caring and generous soul. And so then the curse kind of comes in there and kind of muddies the waters based off of the storytelling. But like I said, if you know what you know about voodoo, it would make sense that she's not malevolent if she is out and she is protecting. She is. And honestly, we have a spirit around here we call the Gray Man, and he shows up right before hurricanes. I'm sure you've heard.
Oh yeah, Polly's Island, right?
Yeah, that's. I was actually on Polly. Hugo came, and I got escorted off by the police. But a friend of mine, who was much older, he was one of the members of the church I went to. He came and told us we all needed to get going. The Gray Man, he'd just seen the Gray Man. And Polly's Island was split in half by that storm. But his house was untouched.
That's wild,
and
yeah.
That's the legend. If you see or hear the Gray Man's there and you heed his warning and you get going, he's going to protect your belongings.
Yeah.
But usually if he shows up, things are going to be bad. And things were really bad from Hugo. So, they harbinger spirits is what they're called. You think Julie Brown has become one of those maybe? She's trying to protect people?
I don't know if she's necessarily a harbinger like that now. I don't necessarily think that she's
well, she doesn't show up, so I guess that doesn't make her a harbinger.
Yeah, and I hate to
yeah,
I mean,
but
Jim Cantore
she's
is
more
the harbinger
protected.
of the hurricanes.
Oh yeah, if Jim shows up or the Gray Man shows up, you know to run.
Yeah, exactly. But no, I mean, she doesn't really show up that way. So
but she's more protective than anything.
Well, I think it's about what she did in life. I think it's that. I don't know if the reports of her spirit and all the other things. I think what I take away from that story is that she was warning in life of what's going to happen and knew it was going to happen. And as a result of that warning, she kind of got vilified for a while as if she was cursing it. And and she kind of was more a foreboding force in life. Now, what her spirit has done since, that's the thing that there's not a lot of stories. There's not a lot of firsthand accounts of her in the swamp. Not a lot really that seem valuable.
I only I could find it all, honestly. And one was that they heard her cackling, and the other was that they saw her walking amongst the trees. But I really didn't know if they were that authentic, and I really couldn't find a lot more. So you're right. There's not a lot of accounts out there,
Yeah.
But again, it is a fascinating story.
Yeah, it's a great. Honestly, I'm surprised more people haven't picked it up yet, and we probably will over the next few years see more because, it's been on a couple TV shows, but it hasn't made its mark too far outside of some of the smaller media and a couple little things here or there, a little travel channel. No ghost hunters other than that MTV show have ever come down to plow through the swamp or anything, and find her.
Yeah. Well, we're running out of time, Brandon. I do thank you for being here. And I want to remind everybody to go check out Brandon's podcast, Southern Gothic. And have you got anything else you're working on that you want to let us know about?
No, man, it's all that podcast all the time. You can keep up with us there. It's on all the apps and everything, or you can visit our website, southerngothicmedia.com.
All right, guys, you've heard it here. Go to southerngothicmedia.com. Get to know Brandon. Hear a little bit about some stories from outside your area, even though I'm trying to expand. I've still got more than 100 here that I've got to throw out. So, Brandon, thank you much for being with me today. I really appreciate it, and good luck to you in all that you're doing.
Thanks for having me, Jonathan.